Hey there, YouTubers! Hi there, Dr. Sheep here. Welcome back to another economics video. Been a little bit, and I like when they're spread out. It doesn't matter. Anyways, today I'm attempting to explain to you how banks work, or to be more meta about things, how I make a living for now. In the event that you don't already know this, but I have a degree in agricultural economics. I currently work as a banker / teller. My degree is on the wall behind the teleprompter. Does this mean I'm qualified to teach you how banks work? I mean, define qualified. My high school chemistry and physics teacher took probably less physics classes than Phil, but according to the state, she could teach, and he can't. Nevertheless, I don't know why every time I do an economics video, I feel the need to vindicate myself, when I've tried to explain the basics of quantum mechanics without hesitation, explanation, or qualification. That's a digression for a podcast every other Friday. Let's focus on the question at hand. How do banks work? Now, when I went to Google with the question, how do banks work, I got a very simple and not very economic and not very cinematic answer. Honestly, it'd be better fit for a TikTok, not a hopefully 10-minute long YouTube video. So I pondered as I read along, is it worth tacking on a bunch of other stuff like the history of money, the history of banks, and then maybe grazing the topic of central banks? Well, here we are. We're going to try it anyways. Well, the history of money is kind of self-explanatory when you begin to talk about utility, and you're never going to hear me mention it again in this video. So, imagine you're a blacksmith that wants to buy a cow from a cow farmer. However, the cow farmer doesn't need anything you make and doesn't need any of the products that other people have traded with you in the past. So, how do you get a cow, and how does the cow farmer make a living selling cows? Money fills the gap and allows for trade to happen more freely. Without it, every time you would need a gallon of milk, let's say, you couldn't just go to Walmart, you'd have to go on 1,000 video game side quests and waste your entire life just to get a sip of mooey juice. Now, I couldn't hope to give you a truly amazing explanation of money and how it started and how economics started, because screw every YouTube video ever. The best explanation I've ever heard came from my intermediate macro professor at the University of Nebraska. Actually, Chris, or more respectfully, Dr. Mann. If you're watching, I doubt it, but if you are, leave a comment. I'd love to have you on the podcast. Talk shop. I'd love to get your opinion on the stimulus checks, the interest rate hikes, inflation, whether COVID was the sole reason of the recession, or whether the lines were in the sand and COVID was just a catalyst. It wasn't necessary for the recession, but it only was there to speed things up. Actually, dang, that sounds like a banger of a research paper. Graduate students, you know what to do. Also, I'm talking about the 2020 recession, and I'm going to call a shot. There's going to be a recession in either Q3 or Q4 of 2022, and I'm wagering that it's either going to start because of the U.S. housing crisis that's currently brewing, or the Chinese housing crisis that's currently brewing. I'm willing to weigh on the Chinese side of things, but you never know. Banking originally began as a way for empires to collect taxes, wage unnecessary wars, and to keep the valuables of the wealthy safe, which reads like a reflection of the current state of the U.S. However, banks wouldn't just stay for the rich, and eventually, almost anybody in the developed world, thanks to strong institutions, is able to save money in a bank. Unlike today, where you have official personal loan officers, the only official loaners back in the day were lending money to empires to, of course, fund wars and to make trade easier. Private individuals had to deal with what we would now call loan sharks. Basically, you don't pay them back, they break your knees. The most interesting development and modernization of banking came in the early days of the Roman Empire. Julius Caesar allowed for creditors to take land from debtors if they were unable to make payments, and this paid the creditors back. This was huge. It sounds basic, like, what? Isn't that how banks work now? But for millennia, this is not how things work, and this was a massive power shift. Power shift from the lords to the banks. This is a fundamental idea of modern lending. Today, banks are allowed to take property that was put up as collateral during negotiations. Basically, when you get a loan from a bank, they want to make sure they're going to get something back. And in the case of mortgages, the house is used. So if you can't make your mortgage payments, the bank is allowed to take the house and resell it to your debtors. Sounds bad, but it makes a lot of sense when you begin to think about it logically. This begins to hint at how banks actually work. Well, at least retail banks. Banks make money by lending it out to people and charging interest as sort of a fee for the amount of time it takes for you to pay them back. They also make money on actual fees for other services they provide, like money orders or cashier's checks. The more observant of you may have noticed that banks seem to already start out with money to lend. This isn't entirely true, though. Banks need money to lend out and get this by offering something called depository services. What are depository services? Well, basically, the bank promises to keep your money safe and readily available on some accounts. However, if people could just pull their money out all at once and any time they want, the bank would never have a stable foot to lend off of. So the bank makes accounts that are more difficult for you to pull your money out of. However, no one is going to let them do this for free. So the bank, in exchange for you keeping your money there long term, pays you interest on the money. This means the more locked down you let the bank make your money, and the longer you let them keep it, the more they will pay you. This next part may seem obvious, but the bank will have much larger interest rates on their loans versus the depository accounts. Duh. If they didn't do this, though, they couldn't pay their employees and they couldn't turn a profit. Because after all, banks are a business. They need to make money. That's it. That's how retail or commercial banks work and make money. However, that's not the whole story, and it's not even the most interesting part. The most interesting part comes from how central banks operate and how they monitor the flow of money in an economy. Yeah, they're that big, they're that interesting. I'd argue they're pretty damn cool. Of course, that's kind of controversial, but that's a different video for a different day. When you boil things down, a central bank loans money out to retail or commercial banks. Why would they do that, you might ask? It's to prevent the literal country's banking system from collapsing. Keeps the economy going, as I said earlier. You think I'm exaggerating? Think back to how commercial banks work. If everyone came in to withdraw all their money at once, the bank wouldn't be able to do it. Not because it doesn't have enough physical cash, but the bank doesn't have enough money, period. This isn't because they lend it all out. Remember, a bank only works if people are keeping their money there long term. So if everybody pulls their money out at once, the bank can't lend it out, which means the bank can't pay the people because they didn't have enough money to begin with because they lent it out. And it's a whole cycle, and the whole thing shuts down, and at some point you find out the banks invested in the stock market and were buying Daddy Bezos stocks. Like, yes, that's a real thing that happens. Banks buy Apple stock. And that's why we have central banks. They basically bail them out. Then you have Big Daddy G, which bails everybody out when basically they lend money out to the small banks, but the small banks, they already shut down, and so therefore they can't pay them back, which caused the whole flow of money to stop, and Big Daddy G is left wondering what the frick happened. And this bit's going on for too long. Basically, they lend small banks money to get them through mass withdrawals. This usually lets them keep going and keep lending out money and lets them pay the central bank back and lets the economy continue to go. But sometimes they can't lend them money fast enough, and the whole thing comes to a grinding halt. From here on out, when I say central banks, I'm basically talking about the U.S.'s central bank because it's the easiest to talk about. Central banks are kind of weird in the fact that a good one works completely independently of the government, i.e. they are immune to rapid changes in governing parties. This isn't to say that the government shouldn't have control at all. In fact, they do, and they have control of the central banks, and they have control of the economy. However, they may not have as much control as you might want or even think. Congress and the president are in control of something called fiscal powers. These are their powers to influence the economy. Whether that's government spending, taxes, or new regulations. Which all kind of boils down to how much the government takes in taxes versus how much it spends versus how much it then needs to borrow because it wrote too many checks. However, these are usually short-term effects, and the real power is reserved for the central banks. This is called monetary policy. The central banks ultimately has the final say on how much fiscal money is printed and how high interest rates are. Yes, the president can keep writing checks, even though the Federal Reserve says stop. It's the president. What are you gonna do? This ultimately is all done to control something called inflation. The higher inflation is, the faster prices increase, and the lower inflation is, the lower prices increase. Inflation is tied to prices. The higher prices are, the lower value your money may seem comparatively to itself before. This has nothing to do with other countries' money. This is your money versus your money in the past. And there is something called deflation, where prices decrease. And it may seem like a good thing right now. It's not always a good thing. There is such a thing as too much of a good thing. And I'm not kidding. Again, this is a gross oversimplification of a massive issue. Inflation and deflation are other topics for another video, for another day that I won't touch with a 10-foot pole. This section's a little weird. Seems kind of out of order, but still necessary. Central banks have been around since the second half of the 1600s, but the modern version of what we see today, at least in the US, didn't start until 1914. This was when the gold standard was dropped in the US. The gold standard was the idea that the value of money was determined by the value of gold. This made tackling issues like inflation pretty easy. If you control the supply of gold, you control the value of your currency. Simple as that. This is where the idea of it's worth its weight in gold came from. However, as World War I started, countries needed to fund their war. And to do this, they needed to print more money. However, this caused massive amounts of inflation because they weren't getting more gold to match the amount of money they were printing. So, to keep the war machine going and to keep economies going, they dropped the gold standard. However, old habits die hard, and after the war, they wanted to switch back because now inflation's going crazy, because your economy's in the toilet, because your whole country's a wasteland. And so they wanted to switch back to what's comfortable to stabilize things. However, this showed the importance of central banks working independently of the government. To my knowledge, no one switched back, and if you're Germany, you just straight up just forgot about how much your money was actually worth and said, it's worth this now. And you also locked a bunch of people in gas chambers. Moving on! Oh no. Anyways, central banks had to find other ways of controlling inflation. Whether that be switching over to a completely different currency and forgetting the old one, who knows. These other methods hint at the buying and selling of government bonds on the open market, which is another video for another day, because it's all about inflation, and inflation's too big. I don't want to touch it. Just go away. Well, that's it. This video is longer and shorter than I expected. The script is shorter and really messy, but I think the video is still going to be long, because again, I summed up like several weeks worth of lectures from college in one video. But again, I could have gone into way more detail, especially about government bonds, but I'm good for now. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. New videos every other Friday, 11 a.m. Central Time, and good night. Considering how late it is, I don't know if we're going to get any comedy mixed in. Because to be quite frankly honest with you, I have no motivation left. Oh boy. Interesting, not a blooper, but just interesting to point out here. War drives technological innovation. War also seems to drive, well, lending and money and innovations in money. It's interesting how conflict breeds better things, except for nuclear war. That just breeds the end of the world. But yeah, war is bad, but it does have some benefits. Not a lot, but some. Banking originally was a way. Take one. Take two. This next scene seems out of place, but it's necessary. Central banks have been around for a long time. Heck, they've been around since the second half of the frick. Take two. Subs for trees. Subs for trees. Subs for trees. Subs for trees. Oh, you're still here? I thought I told you to go home. Oh, you want more? I'm flattered. Check out the playlist. If you want exclusive content, check out my Instagram, Dr_Sheep_YouTube. That's all lowercase. If you want to help the earth, subscribe. When I reach 100 subscribers, I'm going to plant 10 trees. If you feel that's too small, then check out my channel chart where I lay out even bigger goals. Finally, stick around for the next 20 seconds to give me that sweet watch time. Bye.